What happens when a quiet janitor, dismissed by everyone for his humble job and age, shocks a classroom of elitist students with his brilliance in physics? Watch as Marcus Thompson, a man long underestimated, proves that worth is defined by intellect, not appearance. Comment where you're watching from so everyone can join in and enjoy the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you find this story captivating. Marcus Thompson had worked as a janitor at Jefferson High School for over 2 decades. His calloused hands, now stained with the years of hard labor, had scrubbed every floor, cleaned every classroom, and wiped down every desk in the school. No one knew the burden he carried, the weight of a brilliant mind that had been forced to hide in the shadows, buried beneath the humdrum of sweeping hallways and polishing windows. Marcus was a quiet man, always respectful, always keeping to himself. His presence was a blur to the students who walked by, their eyes passing over him as if he were no more than the furniture in the hallways. They never knew his past, the years he spent as one of the brightest students in the physics department at a prestigious university, dreaming of becoming a physicist who would contribute to the world in ways no one had ever imagined. But dreams, as Marcus had learned, didn't belong to people like him. Growing up in a poor neighborhood, Marcus had been the first in his family to attend college. His natural talent for physics was apparent early on. At Columbia University, his professors had been amazed at his ability to unravel complex physical concepts with ease, his sharp intellect cutting through the toughest problems like a knife through butter. But that world of opportunity had been cruel. Marcus had been subjected to racial prejudice at every turn. His peers, wealthy white students, treated him like an outsider, belittling him for his background and the color of his skin. One fateful day, after being humiliated by a group of classmates who had mocked his presence in a study group, Marcus realized something that crushed him to the core. The world would never see him for who he truly was. His dreams of becoming a renowned physicist were destroyed, not by lack of talent, but by the harshness of a society unwilling to accept him. His father had fallen ill, and the burden of supporting his family with mounting medical bills forced Marcus to leave the university. He found a job, humble and demeaning, cleaning the very halls he once dreamed of walking as a professor. And so, for years, Marcus hid his brilliance. He pushed it deep within himself, burying it beneath the daily grind of his janitorial work. His nights were filled with quiet contemplation, thoughts of what could have been, yet the whispers of his former dreams grew quieter as time passed. He lived in silence, invisible to the very people who walked through the halls he cleaned. But things were about to change. It was an ordinary morning when Marcus entered Mr. Richard Anderson's advanced physics class. Mr. Anderson, the school's most arrogant and renowned teacher, had a reputation for his dismissive attitude toward people of color. He often carried himself with a sense of superiority, believing that his knowledge of the subject made him untouchable, invincible. The students in Anderson's class were known to be among the brightest in the school, but they were also known for their condescending attitude toward anyone they deemed beneath them. Marcus, as usual, was a ghost in the background, unnoticed as he quietly wiped away the chalk dust from the floor. But that day, Mr. Anderson noticed him. "Marcus," Anderson called out, his voice dripping with mockery, "I see you've been listening in on my lessons, huh? Why don't you come up here and show us how much you know about physics?" The students immediately erupted in laughter. The idea of the janitor, a man who had been nothing more than a quiet servant in their eyes, challenging their revered teacher, was too much for them to bear. The laughter was cruel, mocking, but Marcus stood still. His heart ached. He could feel the weight of their ridicule pressing down on him, the deep-seated prejudice that had followed him all his life. It would have been so easy to lower his head, to walk away and hide in the shadows as he had always done. But something inside him snapped. For the first time in years, the memories of his past flooded back. His passion for physics, the late nights spent studying, the dreams of changing the world that had been taken from him. The shame he had buried deep within himself gave way to a fire that burned brighter than it ever had before. Without saying a word, Marcus walked to the board, the class falling into an eerie silence. His every step felt like 1,000 eyes were on him, mocking, judging, waiting for him to fail. But Marcus didn't feel fear. He felt something else, An undeniable need to prove to himself and to them that he was not just the janitor they saw. He took the chalk in his hand, his grip steady. The students watched in stunned silence as Marcus stood before the board, poised to solve the complex physics problem that had stumped even Anderson's brightest students. In that moment, Marcus knew that this was his chance to finally show the world what they had denied him for so long. He wasn't just the janitor. He was a man with a mind that could rival the best. And today, he was going to prove it. The classroom was silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights. The laughter from the students had died down, but the mocking gazes of the young faces remained fixed on Marcus. He could feel their eyes burning into him, waiting, anticipating his failure. It would be so easy to turn around, to walk back into the shadows where he had spent so many years, hiding the brilliance within him. He could feel the sting of their laughter echoing in his chest, could almost hear the cruel whispers that had followed him his entire life. But today was different. Marcus's mind flashed back in an instant to the days when he had been the one answering questions in class. His hand always raised, his thoughts always clear. He had once been a student like the ones in this room, hungry for knowledge, eager to prove himself. But the world had different plans for him, plans that were shaped by the color of his skin and the weight of his family's struggles. He had been pushed aside, relegated to a life of cleaning, of scrubbing floors and sweeping hallways, never to be seen as anything more than what others thought him to be. He remembered the day he had left Columbia University, the day he had packed his bags, his heart breaking in his chest as he realized that his dreams were slipping away. His father's illness had left the family struggling, and despite his talents, despite his passion for physics, there was no room for him in a world that only made space for those who had money, power, and privilege. So he had taken the janitor's job at Jefferson High School. It was simple work, humble work, but it was work that kept food on the table. And yet here he was, standing before the chalkboard, about to face down the ridicule of a room full of privileged students who didn't know him, didn't know his story, and certainly didn't know the untapped potential that lived within him. A flicker of hesitation crossed Marcus's mind. Was this really worth it? What did he have to prove to these kids, to this teacher, who had never once shown him the dignity he deserved? Then he thought of his family, of the sacrifices his mother had made, working 2 jobs just to make sure Marcus could attend school, of the quiet nights spent studying when all he wanted was to be out in the world, free from the chains of prejudice and expectation. He remembered the promise he made to himself back then, that one day he would rise above it all. He would not let the world define him. Taking a deep breath, Marcus lifted his hand to the chalkboard. The cold chalk felt heavy in his hand, but as his fingers gripped it, something inside him clicked. This wasn't just about proving something to the class. This was about proving something to himself. The students might see a janitor. Mr. Anderson might see an old, tired man with no future. But Marcus knew the truth. His mind, his knowledge, his capabilities. They hadn't faded. They hadn't disappeared. They had only been waiting for the right moment to emerge. He began to write. The problem on the board was one of the most difficult physics problems in the curriculum, something that had challenged even the brightest students in the class. Marcus glanced at it briefly. A complex problem involving quantum mechanics, the kind of thing that could leave most people scrambling. But not Marcus. For a moment, the room seemed to fall away as his mind began to work, connecting the dots, solving the equations in his head before his chalk ever touched the board. His movements were smooth, confident, as though the chalk in his hand were an extension of his mind. He wrote the first formula, then the second, the third. Each stroke was a declaration. He moved with purpose, every symbol falling into place with a precision that only someone who had spent countless hours immersed in the subject could achieve. As Marcus worked, the class grew silent. The students, who had been snickering just moments before, now sat in stunned silence. They watched in disbelief as the janitor, this man they had never given a second thought, solved the problem with ease, his hand flying across the board, drawing equations and formulas they barely understood. Marcus felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. His mind was laser-focused, and the chalk seemed to move on its own. He didn't care about their surprise, their astonishment. He was beyond that. He was finally doing what he was born to do, in the place he had always dreamed of, standing before a board, teaching, explaining, solving. And then, when the last symbol was written, Marcus set the chalk down with a decisive snap. He stood back, his eyes scanning the board as he took a deep breath. The solution was flawless, every equation perfectly balanced. He turned slowly to face the class, the silence in the room almost deafening. His heart was still racing, his palms slightly damp with sweat, but there was a sense of pride in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about the physics problem. This was about showing them, the students, Mr. Anderson, the world, that he was more than just a janitor. He was a man with a mind that could shape the future if only he had been given the chance. The room was still silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Marcus could feel the shift, the disbelief, the awe, the realization that they had misjudged him. And then slowly a whisper escaped one of the students, barely audible but powerful enough to break the silence. "Unbelievable," a voice muttered from the back of the room. "He really solved it." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. He had done what they thought impossible, but more importantly, he had done it for himself. In that moment, Marcus Thompson knew that the world could never define him again. He had just taken the first step toward reclaiming his dignity, his dreams, and the future he had always deserved. The room was still, thick with tension. No one moved, no one spoke. All eyes were fixed on the chalkboard, where Marcus Thompson had just demonstrated a mastery of physics that no one, least of all Mr. Anderson, had expected. For a moment it felt like time itself had slowed down. The laughter from earlier seemed to have evaporated into thin air, replaced by a stunned silence that hung heavily over the class. Even Mr. Anderson, who had been so sure of his superiority, stood frozen at the front of the room, his smug expression slowly giving way to a look of disbelief. Marcus stood tall, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his heart still racing in his chest. He had done it. He had proven something not only to the class, but to himself. His mind had never left him, never weakened, despite the years of silence and manual labor. He had always known his worth, but now for the first time, the world saw it too. Behind him, the students shifted in their seats. There was no longer any mockery in their eyes, just a growing sense of awe and wonder. They had underestimated him. They had assumed that his life as a janitor had rendered him incapable of solving a problem like this. But Marcus had shattered that illusion with one simple act of defiance. "Mr. Thompson," Mr. Anderson's voice finally broke the silence, but it was no longer filled with arrogance. There was hesitation in it now, an uncertainty that had never been there before. I didn't expect that." Marcus turned slowly to face him. The look in his eyes was calm, steady, no anger, no pride, just a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that had now come to light. "You didn't think I could do it," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You saw me, but you didn't see me. You saw my job, my appearance. You didn't look at the person standing before you." Mr. Anderson opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He had prided himself on his intellect, his ability to outshine everyone around him. But today he had been outshone by someone he had dismissed as nothing more than a laborer. The realization hit him hard. The students were no better. Their faces, once filled with scorn, now reflected a deep sense of discomfort. They had witnessed something that none of them had expected. A janitor, a man they had always ignored, had just solved a problem that even their best and brightest had struggled with. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from fear or anxiety. It was from something else, something stronger than the years of humiliation, stronger than the years of being overlooked and dismissed. It was the power of finally standing tall, of showing the world that he was more than just the sum of his circumstances. For a brief moment, Marcus's mind flashed back to the days when he had been that young student at Columbia University, his future full of promise. Back then, his professors had recognized his brilliance. They had seen in him what others had failed to see, the mind of a scientist, a thinker, a problem solver. But that dream had been shattered long ago, buried beneath the weight of societal expectations and the cruelty of prejudice. Now standing before this class, Marcus realized that he was not that student anymore. He had endured too much, fought too long, to let anyone, especially someone like Mr. Anderson, define him by his past or his job. His gaze swept across the classroom, meeting the eyes of the students one by one. The fear and nervousness in their eyes were slowly being replaced by a new understanding. They had seen him as invisible, as nothing more than a background figure in their lives. But today, Marcus had shown them that they had been wrong. He had shown them that intelligence, dignity, and worth weren't defined by skin color or occupation. They were defined by the person themselves. With a final glance at Mr. Anderson, who stood there speechless, Marcus turned and walked toward the door. The classroom remained silent behind him. The weight of his actions hung in the air, heavier than any chalkboard equation he had ever solved. As he stepped into the hallway, Marcus felt the eyes of the students following him. But this time, their gaze was different. They didn't look at him with scorn or indifference. Instead, they looked at him with something new: respect. It was a small victory, but for Marcus Thompson, it was everything. He had proven that he was not just a janitor. He was a man who deserved to be seen for who he truly was. A man who had fought against the tide of prejudice and for the first time had won. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and heavy, long after Marcus Thompson had left. The students sat motionless, their minds still processing what they had just witnessed. The man they had dismissed for years, ignored and mocked for the very job that had provided for his family, had just exposed their ignorance. In one calculated moment, Marcus had not only solved an impossible physics problem, but had shattered the walls of prejudice that had kept him invisible in their eyes. Mr. Anderson stood at the front of the room, still frozen, his expression no longer one of condescension, but one of profound discomfort. He had expected to prove his superiority, to put the janitor in his place. Instead, Marcus had flipped the script, and now it was Mr. Anderson who felt small. The realization of how wrong he had been stung like an open wound, and for the first time, he didn't know how to respond. The students, sensing the shift, began to murmur among themselves. Whispers floated around the room, barely audible but brimming with disbelief. "No way! Did he really solve that?" one student asked, his voice a mix of awe and confusion. "Unbelievable," another student replied, shaking her head. "He's a genius." And with each passing whisper, the seeds of change were planted. The class, once filled with arrogance and derision, now found itself grappling with a new reality. They had learned a lesson they hadn't signed up for. The person they had viewed as nothing more than the help, as invisible and inconsequential, had just proven them all wrong. Outside the classroom, in the quiet corridors of Jefferson High, Marcus quietly went about his work, sweeping the same hallways he had swept every day for years. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but there was an overwhelming sense of relief that filled his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. For the first time, he felt seen, not just by the students, but by the world around him. They had underestimated him, written him off, and today he had shown them that his worth wasn't determined by the job he did or the color of his skin. It was determined by the strength of his mind and his resilience. But even as Marcus walked away from the classroom, he knew that the impact of what had just happened would reverberate throughout the school. It wouldn't be an immediate change. After all, the walls of prejudice and bias had been built over generations. But today, Marcus had cracked those walls, and for the first time, the cracks had started to spread. That afternoon, as Marcus continued his janitorial duties, he was approached by a few students. Their steps were hesitant at first, unsure of what to say or how to react. But as they got closer, one of them spoke. "Mr. Thompson," a young man began, his voice softer now, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what I thought about you before. I didn't know." Marcus stopped what he was doing, looking the student in the eye. The apology was sincere, but it wasn't just about what had happened in the classroom. It was about the years of misconceptions, about how people had judged him without ever really knowing him. Marcus nodded, his eyes steady but gentle. "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "But it's not just about me. It's about seeing people for who they truly are, not for what we assume them to be. We all have our stories, and sometimes we judge too quickly. The student nodded, understanding more than he had before, and then without another word, he walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of Marcus's actions spread through the school like wildfire. It wasn't just the students who were affected. Faculty members, too, began to question their own biases. Teachers who had never spoken to Marcus before now nodded at him as he passed in the hallways. Some even stopped to say a few words, offering a brief, genuine acknowledgement of the work he did. The change was subtle, but it was there. It was real. But the most unexpected moment came when Mr. Anderson found himself alone with Marcus in the hallway. The once arrogant teacher, who had spent years looking down on the janitor, now stood before him, his demeanor markedly different. "Marcus," Mr. Anderson said, his voice low and hesitant, "I owe you an apology. I've never treated you with the respect you deserve, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Marcus looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. This wasn't the smug, self-satisfied man who had once mocked him. This was someone who, for the first time, had realized his own mistake. "I appreciate that," Marcus replied, his tone gentle but firm. "But it's not just about me. It's about all of us. We all have a part to play in changing how we see each other." Mr. Anderson nodded, his face flushed with shame. "You're right. And I'll work harder to make sure I don't make that mistake again." As the conversation ended, Marcus felt something shift within him. He had spent years hiding, blending into the background, hoping the world wouldn't notice him. But now, after everything that had happened, he realized he didn't need to hide anymore. He had earned the respect of his peers, not through grand gestures, but through quiet strength, intellect, and dignity. It was a small victory, but for Marcus Thompson, it was a victory that would resonate for the rest of his life. The days that followed Marcus Thompson's brilliant demonstration in Mr. Anderson's physics class were filled with subtle but significant change. The whispers that had once been laced with mockery were now filled with respect, admiration, and a newfound understanding. Jefferson High School was changing, and it was changing because of one quiet man who had dared to defy the expectations of an entire institution. In the following weeks, Marcus continued with his janitorial duties, his work no different than before. Yet he felt the atmosphere shift around him. Students who had once hurried past him with averted eyes now greeted him with nods and smiles. Teachers who had ignored his presence or passed him by with barely a glance now acknowledged him with quiet respect. Some even paused to speak with him, offering genuine words of appreciation for the work he did. It was a small but powerful change. The invisible walls of prejudice that had once surrounded Marcus were now beginning to crumble. His presence, once taken for granted, was now recognized not just for the labor he performed, but for the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. The school, slowly but surely, was learning to see him as more than just the janitor. They were learning to see him as a man, as someone who had dreams, intelligence, and a past they had never known. But the most important moment came when Marcus was approached by Principal Robert Williams. The principal had been closely following the events since that fateful day in Mr. Anderson's class, and he had seen firsthand the transformation that had taken place within the school. He was deeply moved by Marcus's strength and the impact his actions had had on the students and staff. "Marcus," Principal Williams said one afternoon, his tone respectful and sincere, "I've been thinking about what happened in Mr. Anderson's class, and I want to offer you something. We could use someone like you here at Jefferson, not just as a janitor, but as a teacher, a part-time physics instructor perhaps. I think the students would benefit from your knowledge." Marcus looked at Principal Williams, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. The offer was tempting, but it wasn't the title or the position that mattered to him. He had spent enough time in the shadows, but what mattered most was the respect he had finally earned. "Thank you, Mr. Williams," Marcus said softly, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your offer, but I think I've already found my place here. I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do." Principal Williams nodded, understanding the quiet resolve in Marcus's words. "I understand, but know this. You've taught us all something valuable, Marcus. You've shown us that respect isn't something that should be earned through titles or positions, but through our actions. And for that, I am grateful." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had never needed a title to prove his worth. His value had never been in the job he did or the recognition he received. His worth was in his intellect, his dignity, and his unwavering resolve to never let the world define him by his circumstances. In the weeks that followed, Marcus continued to work quietly, humbly, his impact growing in ways he could never have anticipated. The students who had once mocked him now looked up to him, not just as the janitor, but as a symbol of resilience, strength, and the fight against prejudice. And for Mr. Anderson, the change was perhaps the most profound. The teacher who had once ridiculed Marcus now found himself actively promoting anti-racism initiatives within the school. He spoke openly to his students about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned from Marcus's quiet defiance. The man who had once looked down on Marcus had become an advocate for change, for equality, and for respect, thanks to the profound lesson he had learned from the most unlikely of sources. As for Marcus, he remained unchanged in the way he carried out his duties. He didn't seek accolades or recognition. He didn't need them. The respect he had earned was enough, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his actions had made a difference, not just in the school, but in the hearts of those who had once overlooked him. The school, too, had changed. No longer a place where prejudice quietly lingered in the background, Jefferson High was now a school where discussions on race, dignity, and respect were part of the curriculum. Students and faculty alike had learned the hard way that a person's worth was not defined by the job they did or the color of their skin, but by their character and the integrity with which they lived their lives. Marcus Thompson had proven that one person could spark change, without fanfare, without expectation. And in doing so, he had shown everyone that respect, dignity, and equality should never be determined by external factors. They are born from within, from the strength of character, the courage to stand up against prejudice, and the willingness to see others for who they truly are.